You believe that to heal an attachment, you must fight against it, force the mind to forget. But Zen masters have taught for centuries the liberating paradox. True healing comes not from strength, but from gentle surrender. When you stop fighting your pain and instead welcome it as a messenger, transformation happens effortlessly. Prepare to sleep, because tonight, as you just listen, these ancient stories will teach you how to let go of what weighs you down without you having to use any force at all. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment which part of the world you're watching from. Settle in and relax. Let's begin. Imagine yourself sitting across from a Zen master, eager to receive profound wisdom. You've studied philosophy for years, read countless books, and consider yourself quite knowledgeable. The master offers you tea. As you watch, he pours the steaming liquid into your cup, but doesn't stop when it's full. Tea overflows, spilling onto the table in your lap. You jump back in alarm. What are you doing?" you exclaim. The master simply smiles and says, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" This story, known as the empty cup, is one of the most renowned Zen parables and has been shared for centuries across Eastern philosophical traditions. Its enduring appeal lies in the simple yet powerful truth it conveys about how we approach learning and growth in our lives. The tale has become a cornerstone of Zen Buddhist teaching on the nature of mind and the obstacles we create for ourselves through rigid thinking and attachment to preconceived notions. The metaphor of the overflowing cup brilliantly illustrates how our minds become so filled with opinions, judgments, and preconceptions that there's no room for new insights or perspectives. When we approach life with a mind already made up, we essentially block our ability to perceive reality clearly. This mental fullness prevents us from experiencing the richness of the present moment and limits our capacity for genuine understanding. In Buddhism, this tendency to cling to established thought patterns is considered a major obstacle to enlightenment. The Buddha taught that our suffering often stems from attachment, not just to material possessions, but to ideas, beliefs, and mental constructs we've built over time. These mental attachments can be even more difficult to recognize and release than physical ones because they become integral to our sense of identity. We don't simply have opinions. In many ways, we believe we are our opinions. The process of emptying the cup requires tremendous courage. It asks us to temporarily set aside beliefs we may have held for decades, concepts that may have helped us navigate the world, and ideas that might form the foundation of our self-image. This doesn't mean blindly rejecting all previous knowledge or adopting an attitude of ignorance. Rather, it suggests approaching each moment with what Zen practitioners call beginner's mind, a state of openness, eagerness, and lack of preconceptions, even when studying advanced subjects. When we practice emptying our cup in everyday life, we create space for authentic wisdom to emerge. This often happens naturally during moments of awe, perhaps while standing beneath a star-filled sky or witnessing the birth of a child. In these instances, our conceptual mind temporarily steps aside, allowing us to experience reality directly, without the filter of our preconceptions. Zen practice aims to cultivate this state of receptive awareness more consistently, not just during extraordinary moments. Many people misunderstand what it means to empty the cup. They believe it requires becoming passive or abandoning critical thinking. Nothing could be further from the truth. Emptying the cup means developing an active awareness of our own thought processes and the filters through which we perceive the world. It involves becoming intimately familiar with how our minds create and maintain conceptual frameworks, and learning to hold those frameworks lightly rather than grasping them as absolute truth. Practically speaking, we can begin emptying our cups by practicing mindful listening. Most of us listen to others while simultaneously preparing our responses or filtering what we hear through our existing beliefs. True listening means temporarily suspending judgment and genuinely opening ourselves to another perspective. This doesn't mean we must agree with everything we hear, but it does require giving others the gift of our full attention before forming conclusions. Another practical approach is to regularly question our certainties. What beliefs do we hold so firmly that we never examine them? What opinions might we be clinging to simply because they are comfortable or familiar? By cultivating healthy doubt toward our own mental constructs, we loosen their grip and create space for new understanding. The empty cup philosophy extends beyond spiritual practice into many areas of life. In education, the most effective teachers recognize when students' cups are full and find creative ways to help them create space for new information. In relationships, partners who can temporarily set aside their perspectives can truly understand each other's needs and feelings. In business, Leaders who remain open to fresh ideas often innovate more successfully than those who rigidly adhere to established thinking. The metaphor also reminds us that emptying the cup isn't a one-time event, but a continuous practice. Our minds naturally fill up again with opinions, judgments, and preconceptions. The work of emptying must be done regularly, like cleaning a window that constantly accumulates dust. Through consistent practice, we can develop the habit of approaching life with freshness and genuine curiosity. When we successfully empty our cups, we often discover that the wisdom we sought was available all along, but our preconceptions prevented us from recognizing it. There's a profound paradox here. By letting go of what we think we know, we create the conditions for true knowing to emerge. The empty cup becomes a vessel capable of receiving the present moment in its fullness, unclouded by the distortions of our preconceived ideas. In essence, the parable of the empty cup invites us to consider that our greatest obstacle to growth and understanding may not be what we don't know, but what we think we already know. By cultivating the willingness to set aside our accumulated knowledge and approach life with openness and humility, we create the possibility for transformation and authentic wisdom to enter our lives. The first step on the path to genuine insight may be simply acknowledging how full our cups have become. Ham the finger. Pointing to the moon, abandoning symbols for reality. Have you ever had someone point out a distant star in the night sky, only to find yourself staring at their finger instead of looking where they're pointing? This everyday confusion mirrors one of Buddhism's most profound teachings about our tendency to mistake symbols for the reality they represent. In Zen Buddhism, there's a famous saying, "The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon." This simple statement contains a world of wisdom about how we perceive reality and the barriers we create through our attachment to concepts, words, and symbols. The origin of this teaching is often attributed to the Buddha himself, who reportedly cautioned his disciples not to mistake his teachings, the Fingenböge, for the enlightenment they pointed toward, the moon. Later, this idea became central to Zen Buddhism, which developed a healthy skepticism toward excessive reliance on scriptures, rituals, and doctrinal learning. The teaching warns against the fundamental human tendency to confuse the map with the territory, the menu with the meal, the description with what is being described. This confusion happens constantly in our daily lives, often without our awareness. We mistake words for the things they represent, confuse symbols with reality, and get lost in descriptions rather than experiencing directly. Think about how often we reduce complex experiences to simple labels. We say "I am angry" as if anger were a fixed, solid entity, rather than a passing constellation of bodily sensations, thoughts, and emotional energies. We treat the word love as if it captures the full range of that profound experience. We debate abstractions like freedom or justice without connecting these concepts to lived reality. In spiritual and religious contexts, this confusion becomes particularly problematic. Practitioners may become so attached to specific interpretations of texts, particular ritual forms, or theological concepts that they lose sight of the direct experience these elements were designed to evoke. They might argue fiercely about doctrinal points while missing the transformative insights the doctrines were meant to facilitate. In Zen terms, they're arguing about different descriptions of the moon while never looking up at the night sky. This tendency to mistake symbols for reality has deep cognitive roots. Our minds naturally work through representation. We use concepts, images, and language to make sense of our experience. This representational thinking has tremendous practical value. It allows us to communicate, plan, solve problems, and navigate complex social environments. However, these same mental tools can become barriers to direct experience when we forget their provisional nature and treat them as ultimate reality. Zen masters throughout history developed various methods to help students break free from this confusion. Many of these approaches involve deliberate disruption of conceptual thinking. The famous Zen koans, paradoxical riddles like "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" are designed specifically to short-circuit our habitual conceptual processes. When confronted with a question that cannot be answered through conventional thinking, the student may experience a moment of mental openness in which direct perception becomes possible. Another method Zen masters employed was sudden, unexpected action. There are countless stories of masters responding to philosophical questions with seemingly unrelated physical actions, slapping a student, throwing a sandal, or suddenly shouting. These responses weren't meant to be cruel or arbitrary, but to jolt students out of conceptual thinking into immediate presence. When a student asked Master Guti about the nature of Buddhism, he simply raised one finger. This gesture wasn't meant to symbolize a concept, but to direct the student toward direct experience beyond words. The digital age has perhaps made this confusion between symbol and reality even more prevalent. We live increasingly in worlds of representation, social media profiles that stand in for real people, digital images that substitute for direct experience, and endless text describing experiences rather than having them. Many people travel to beautiful locations only to experience them through their phone cameras, more concerned with capturing and sharing the moment than actually being in it. In Zen terms, they're so busy pointing fingers that they never see the moon. Breaking free from this confusion requires developing what Zen calls direct pointing at the human mind. This approach bypasses elaborative thinking and conceptualization to experience reality without intermediaries. It's like the difference between reading about swimming, talking about swimming, watching videos about swimming techniques, and actually diving into water. No matter how sophisticated our understanding of swimming might be, it remains fundamentally different from the direct experience of being in water. This direct experience isn't mystical or supernatural, it's actually our most natural state before we overlay it with conceptual thinking. Young children experience the world this way before they fully develop language. Artists often access this direct perception when fully absorbed in their creative process. Athletes experience it as being in the zone. These are all glimpses of what happens when we temporarily set aside our conceptualizing mind and engage directly with our experience. Practically speaking, we can cultivate this direct perception in several ways. Mindfulness meditation trains us to observe our tendency to get caught in concepts and gently return to direct experience of breathing, bodily sensations, or sensory perception. Spending time in nature often helps us drop conceptual thinking and connect directly with our surroundings. Creative activities can bypass our verbal, analytical mind and engage more immediate modes of knowing. Even simple practices like eating mindfully, really tasting our food rather than thinking about it, can help us distinguish the finger from the moon. The finger moon teaching doesn't suggest that concepts, language, and symbols have no value. The finger pointing to the moon serves an essential purpose. Without it, we might not know where to look. Spiritual teachings, practices, and traditions are valuable precisely because they orient us toward experiences we might otherwise miss. The problem arises only when we mistake the pointer for what it points toward, when we become so enamored with the map that we never embark on the actual journey. Ultimately, the teaching about the finger pointing to the moon invites us to examine our relationship with symbols and reality. Are we content with descriptions, concepts, and secondhand knowledge? Or do we long for direct experience? Do we collect spiritual ideas, or do we put them into practice? Do we mistake the words of wise teachers for wisdom itself, by recognizing the provisional nature of all concepts, seeing them as tools rather than truths? We can use them skillfully without becoming trapped by them. We can follow where the finger points and actually see the moon in all its luminous wonder. The teachings about recognizing our preconceptions and not confusing symbols with reality naturally lead us to another profound Zen concept. In Buddhist tradition, even the most sacred teachings are meant to be tools for awakening, rather than objects of attachment themselves. This principle is beautifully illustrated in one of the Buddha's most practical and profound parables, the story of the raft. The Buddha once told his disciples about a traveller who came to a vast expanse of water. The near shore was dangerous and frightening, while the far shore offered safety. Having no boat or bridge, the traveller diligently gathered branches, leaves, and reeds to construct a raft. Through great effort, he built a vessel sturdy enough to carry him across the dangerous waters to safety on the opposite shore. This raft served him well and was instrumental in his successful crossing. Now, the Buddha asked his disciples, what should the wise traveller do with the raft after reaching the far shore? Should he, out of gratitude and attachment, hoist it onto his shoulders and carry it with him on his inland journey? His disciples understood the obvious answer. No, that would be absurd. The wise traveller would recognize that while the raft was invaluable for crossing the water, its purpose had been fulfilled. He might leave it at the shore for someone else to use, or simply let it go, understanding that carrying it further would transform a useful tool into a needless burden. In the same way, the Buddha explained, my teachings are like a raft. He taught that the Dharma, Buddhist teachings and practices, exists solely for crossing over the waters of suffering to the shore of liberation. Once its purpose is fulfilled, even the Dharma should not be clung to. This doesn't mean disrespecting or discarding spiritual teachings carelessly. Rather, it points to the middle way between two extremes, rejecting teachings prematurely before they've served their purpose, or clinging to them as ultimate truths rather than skillful means. This teaching strikes at something quite counterintuitive for many spiritual practitioners. We often think that the more deeply we commit to spiritual teachings, the more we should cherish and defend them. There's a natural tendency to become attached to doctrines and practices that have brought us insight or comfort. We may build our identities around being followers of particular teachings, defend our interpretations against others, or cling to forms and rituals that once facilitated awakening but have become routine. The raft parable challenges this tendency directly. It suggests that the ultimate purpose of any genuine spiritual teaching is not to create another object of attachment, but to free us from attachment altogether. The teachings are medicinal, dhammas. Their purpose is to cure the disease of suffering. Once health is restored, carrying around the medicine becomes unnecessary and could even become harmful. Throughout Buddhist history, various schools and teachers have emphasized this non-attachment to doctrine in different ways. Zen Buddhism perhaps took it furthest with sayings like, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him," a deliberately shocking instruction meant to prevent students from turning the Buddha or his teachings into objects of attachment that would impede their direct experience of reality. We can see this principle at work in how some long-term meditation practitioners evolve in their practice. A beginner might need to follow instructions very precisely, counting breaths or noting sensations exactly as taught. As practice deepens, these structured techniques gradually give way to more natural, effortless awareness. The scaffolding of technique becomes less necessary as direct understanding emerges. The formal practice that once required effort becomes integrated into everyday life. The raft has served its purpose. This principle extends beyond formal spiritual contexts into everyday life. Consider how we learn any new skill. When first learning to drive a car, we consciously follow every rule and technique we've been taught. We think about how far to turn the steering wheel, when to check mirrors, how hard to press the brake pedal. With experience, these conscious techniques recede into the background as driving becomes more intuitive. If we continued to drive while consciously reciting every rule and technique we'd learned, our driving would actually become worse, not better. The instructions have served their purpose and must now be integrated rather than consciously applied. Similarly, in relationships, we might initially follow advice from books or counselors about communication techniques or conflict resolution strategies. These structures and guidelines can be extremely valuable when developing relationship skills. However, a mature relationship generally flows more naturally, with partners who have internalized healthy patterns rather than mechanically applying techniques. The relationship advice has served as a raft, but carrying it consciously through every interaction would create artificiality. What makes the raft parable so practical is that it encourages us to regularly examine what we're carrying that has already served its purpose. Are there beliefs, practices, or identities we're clutching that once helped us cross difficult waters but now only weigh us down? Are we clinging to spiritual techniques that once felt revolutionary but have become empty routines? Are we defending doctrines so fiercely that we've lost sight of the freedom they were meant to facilitate? The Buddha emphasized that his teaching was pragmatic, not dogmatic. He compared himself to a physician offering medicine appropriate to specific conditions, not a philosopher promoting an ideology to be defended at all costs. This pragmatism invites us to hold teachings lightly, using them skillfully, while remembering that they point beyond themselves to direct experience. Importantly, the raft parable doesn't suggest abandoning practices prematurely. A traveller who pushes away the raft while still in the middle of the river misunderstands the teaching as badly as one who carries it on land. Spiritual practices and ethical guidelines serve essential purposes on the path. The teaching simply reminds us that these tools are means, not ends, vehicles for crossing over, not destinations in themselves. The true test of spiritual maturity may not be how firmly we cling to teachings, but how willingly we can let them go when they've fulfilled their purpose. The teachings themselves become most alive when held in open hands rather than clenched fists, when we relate to them as invitations to direct experience rather than doctrines requiring defense. When we truly understand the parable of the raft, We use the teachings with gratitude while remaining ready to set them down when they've carried us across the waters of suffering to the shore of freedom. This emphasis on non-attachment to teachings connects naturally with another classic Zen story that further illuminates how we create unnecessary suffering through rigid thinking. This famous tale involves two monks debating about a flag flapping in the wind. One morning at a temple, two monks were watching a flag moving in the breeze. The first monk said confidently, "The flag is moving." The second monk disagreed, saying, "No, the wind is moving." Each monk became increasingly attached to his position, and their disagreement escalated into a heated argument. Neither would to concede his view, each believing his perception represented objective reality. As they argued, their master happened to be passing by and overheard their dispute. After listening for a moment, he interrupted them, saying, "Neither the flag nor the wind is moving. It is your mind that is moving." Upon hearing these words, both monks fell silent, suddenly recognizing the truth in their teacher's statement. This deceptively simple story contains layers of insight about how we create division and conflict through our tendency to mistake our perceptions for objective reality. The two monks weren't really arguing about the flag or the wind, they were arguing about their own mental constructs, each believing his view captured the whole truth. Neither could see that his perception was just one way of framing the situation, not an absolute reality. The master's intervention points to a profound understanding of interdependence. From one perspective, the flag is moving. From another, the wind is moving. From yet another, the earth is moving as it rotates on its axis. Each perspective offers a partial truth, but none captures the complete reality of what's happening. More fundamentally, the very categories of flag, wind, and movement are mental constructions, useful for communication, but not ultimate realities existing independently of the mind that perceives them. In Buddhist terms, this story illustrates the concept of non-duality, the understanding that the categories and distinctions we create with our minds don't reflect absolute divisions in reality itself. We habitually divide the world into subject and object, self and other, mind and body, good and bad. We then mistake these mental divisions for the structure of reality itself, forgetting that we created the boundaries in the first place. This forgetting has serious consequences in our daily lives. Consider how often conflicts arise because different people perceive the same situation through different mental frameworks. In family disagreements, workplace disputes, or political debates, we often behave like the two monks, each person convinced that their perception represents objective reality, unable to recognize that all perspectives are partial and conditioned. Zen practice offers a way beyond this trap by training us to recognize when we're caught in dualistic thinking. Through meditation, we learn to observe how our minds automatically categorize, judge, and create boundaries. We notice how we constantly divide experience into me and not me, how we separate what we like from what we don't like, how we create stories about how things are that may have little connection to direct experience. As this awareness deepens, we begin to hold our perceptions more lightly. We can still use conceptual thinking when it's useful, distinguishing between food that nourishes us and food that harms us, for example, without believing that our categories capture the whole of reality. We develop what some Zen teachers call don't know mind, a humble recognition that our understanding is always partial and provisional. This non-dual awareness doesn't mean erasing all distinctions or claiming that everything is one in some vague mystical sense. Rather, it means recognizing that distinctions emerge from the way our minds work rather than existing as fixed boundaries in reality itself. The categories we create are tools, not truths. They're useful for certain purposes, but become problematic when we forget their provisional nature. In practical terms, transcending duality might look like holding our opinions more lightly, listening more deeply to perspectives that differ from our own, or noticing when we're creating unnecessary opposition through our thinking. It might mean recognizing that the boundaries between work and play, spiritual and mundane, or self and other, are more permeable and context-dependent than we usually assume. The story of the flag teaches us to look for the mind's movement behind our perceptions, to ask not just what we're seeing but how we're seeing it. When we find ourselves in conflict with others, we can ask, am I mistaking my perspective for the whole truth? What assumptions or categories am I treating as fixed realities? How might this situation look from a completely different viewpoint? Perhaps most importantly, the story invites us to notice our attachment to being right. Both monks were so invested in their positions that they couldn't see the limitations of their perspectives. This attachment to correctness creates unnecessary suffering in countless ways, from minor disagreements with friends to major conflicts between nations. When we cling to our viewpoints as if our identity depends on them, we close ourselves off from learning and connection. The freedom that comes from recognizing it is mind that moves isn't a detached indifference to truth. Rather, it's the freedom to engage with life more directly, without the filters of rigid concepts and fixed positions. It allows us to respond to situations with appropriate flexibility rather than applying the same conceptual framework to every circumstance. Like water that adapts to any container, the mind that recognizes its own movement can flow with changing conditions instead of struggling against them. When we truly understand the lesson of the flag and the wind, we can hold even our most cherished views as working hypotheses rather than absolute truths. We can use concepts when they're helpful while remembering that the map is not the territory. We can engage in discussions not to prove ourselves right but to deepen understanding. We can recognize that even our most profound insights are fingers pointing to the moon, rafts for crossing the river, tools for liberation rather than new attachments to defend. The realization that our fixed perspectives create unnecessary divisions naturally leads us to examine perhaps the most fundamental attachment of all, our attachment to a fixed sense of self. In Buddhism, particularly in Zen, there is a profound teaching that challenges our deeply held belief in a permanent, unchanging I that persists through time. This teaching is often illustrated through the metaphor of a flowing river, never the same for even 2 consecutive moments. An ancient Greek philosopher once observed that you cannot step into the same river twice. This insight aligns perfectly with the Buddhist understanding of impermanence and non-self. Just as a river is in constant flux, water molecules flowing, banks gradually shifting, depth changing with the seasons, our sense of self is actually a continuously changing process rather than a fixed entity. We tend to believe there's a solid, consistent me that remains the same from childhood through adulthood into old age, but closer examination reveals something quite different. Think about who you were 10 years ago. You likely had different interests, beliefs, relationships, and perhaps even values. Your body has replaced nearly all its cells. Your brain has formed new neural connections while pruning others. Your memories have changed, some fading, some becoming more pronounced, and many being subtly rewritten each time you recall them. Even your personality traits may have shifted significantly. In what sense then are you the same person you were a decade ago? The convention of using the same name and having continuous memories creates an illusion of sameness that masks constant transformation. Buddhism doesn't deny our conventional sense of identity, but clearly we function in the world as individuals with particular histories and characteristics. What it challenges is the notion that beneath all our changing experiences lies a permanent independent self or soul that owns these experiences. When we look carefully at our moment-to-moment experience, what we find is a flow of sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, but no solid experiencer standing apart from these experiences. This insight doesn't come easily. Our entire language is structured around the assumption of a solid self. I am thinking, I feel, I remember. These expressions are practical for communication, but reinforce the illusion that there must be a substantial I doing the thinking, feeling, and remembering. Meditation practice allows us to observe directly how thoughts and feelings arise and pass without requiring someone to do the thinking or feeling. They simply happen like weather patterns in the mind. The Buddha taught that this mistaken belief in a permanent, separate self is the root cause of our suffering. When we believe we are solid, separate selves, we naturally try to protect and enhance this self, comparing ourselves to others, seeking validation, accumulating possessions and achievements as extensions of self, and fearing anything that threatens our self-concept. We become like someone trying to grab onto specific parts of the river, becoming frustrated when the water inevitably flows through our fingers. This doesn't mean we don't exist. Rather, it points to a more fluid, interconnected way of existing than our usual self-concept suggests. The Buddhist teaching on non-self, anatta, isn't nihilistic but liberating. It's not that there's no river, it's that the river exists as a process rather than a fixed entity. Similarly, our sense of self exists as an ongoing process of thinking, feeling, perceiving, and acting, constantly changing and intimately connected with everything around us. Practically speaking, how does understanding non-self help us live with less suffering? When we hold our sense of identity more lightly, we become less defensive. Criticism doesn't feel like an attack on our core being, but merely feedback about particular behaviors or ideas that themselves are impermanent. We don't need to construct elaborate life stories that portray us as consistently smart, kind, or successful, papering over evidence to the contrary. We can acknowledge our mistakes and our limitations without feeling they define us permanently. This lighter relationship with identity also allows for greater authenticity and growth. Many people stay trapped in limiting self-concepts. I'm not a math person. I'm always anxious in social situations. I could never be a leader. Treating temporary patterns as if they were permanent traits. Recognizing the fluid nature of self opens us to new possibilities. If there's no fixed self to protect or maintain, we're free to explore and evolve without feeling we're betraying who we really are. The river metaphor helps us understand another crucial aspect of non-self: interdependence. A river doesn't exist independently. It's formed by rainfall, shaped by the landscape, affected by what flows into it, influencing everything downstream. Similarly, our sense of self emerges from countless conditions: our genetic inheritance, family dynamics, cultural context, education, relationships, and countless other influences. We don't create ourselves from nothing. We arise in dependence on the innumerable factors, many beyond our control or awareness. Meditation provides a direct method for exploring this territory. When we sit quietly and observe our experience without judgment, we can watch how sensations, emotions, and thoughts arise and pass away on their own. We notice how a thought appears seemingly from nowhere, lingers briefly, then dissolves, followed by another thought that might contradict the first. We observe how the mind automatically creates a story of self, claiming some experiences while rejecting others. With continued practice, we begin to hold this story more lightly, seeing it as a useful convention rather than an ultimate truth. This letting go of a fixed self-identity doesn't mean abandoning responsibility or ethical concerns. In fact, understanding interdependence often enhances our sense of responsibility, as we recognize how our actions influence countless beings with whom we're interconnected. Rather than acting to build up or defend a solid self, we can act from awareness of our connectedness, considering the wider impact of our choices. This shift from self-centered to more inclusive motivation naturally leads to greater kindness and ethical sensitivity. The teaching of non-self points to a more fluid, spacious way of being in the world, like a river that flows freely around obstacles rather than crashing against them. By loosening our grip on a fixed identity, we become more adaptable, less defensive, more open to experience. The self still functions as a practical reference point, but we're not fooled into thinking it's a permanent, independent entity. Like the river that is never the same yet continues flowing, we can embrace both continuity and change, identity and transformation. This understanding of the fluid, impermanent nature of self naturally connects with another key, Zen, teaching about finding freedom through simplicity. There's a famous story about a renowned Japanese Zen master who lived in a small hut at the foot of a mountain. One evening, a thief broke in, only to discover there was nothing worth stealing. The Zen master returned and caught him in the act. "You've come a long way to visit me," he told the thief, "and you shouldn't return empty-handed. Please take my clothes as a gift." The bewildered thief took the clothes and fled. The master sat naked, watching the moon from his window. "Poor fellow," he mused. "I wish I could give him this beautiful moon." This story illustrates the remarkable freedom that comes from non-attachment to possessions. The master's lack of possessions didn't represent deprivation, but liberation. He was so unattached to material things that he could offer his clothes to the thief and still find joy in the moonlight that couldn't be stolen or given away. Throughout Zen history, many masters have demonstrated this freedom through extreme simplicity. One famous teacher was known to own just one simple tea bowl that had a crack in it. When asked why he didn't replace it, he explained that the bowl served its purpose perfectly well, and its imperfection reminded him of the beauty of impermanence. Another master, upon being awarded a gorgeous ceramic piece by the emperor, promptly used it as a chamber pot, not out of disrespect, but to demonstrate that an object's value doesn't lie in its status or appearance, but in its usefulness. This simplicity isn't about forcing oneself to live in poverty or denying the practical value of certain possessions. Rather, it represents a shift in relationship with material things, from seeing them as extensions of self or sources of status, to viewing them as temporary tools for specific purposes. The tea bowl is useful for drinking tea, but it doesn't define its owner. When we stop identifying with our possessions, seeing them as mine in some deep sense that connects to our identity, we experience a profound liberation. Most of us in modern consumer societies experience the opposite of this freedom. We accumulate far more than we need, often going into debt to acquire possessions that we hope will enhance our sense of self or signal our status to others. We then must maintain, insure, organise, clean, store, and worry about these possessions. What initially seemed like objects we owned gradually come to own us, demanding our time, attention, and resources. As one Zen saying puts it, the more possessions, the more anxiety. The freedom of simplicity extends beyond material possessions to other aspects of life. Many Zen practitioners find that simplifying their schedules, doing fewer things with greater presence rather than filling every moment with activity, creates a sense of spaciousness and ease. Simplifying relationships might mean focusing on a few deep connections rather than maintaining dozens of superficial ones. Simplifying information intake might mean consuming less news and social media in favour of more direct experience of the world. This simplicity practice connects directly with the teaching on non-self. Many of our possessions serve primarily to reinforce and communicate our sense of identity, the books that signal our intellectual interests, the clothes that express our personal style, the household objects that tell stories about who we think we are. As we loosen our attachment to a fixed self-concept, we naturally become less concerned with maintaining and displaying an identity through ownership. The practical benefits of this approach are significant. With fewer possessions requiring our care and attention, we have more time and energy for what truly matters. With less attachment to material things, we experience less anxiety about loss or damage. With a simpler schedule, we can be more fully present for each activity rather than constantly rushing from one thing to the next. Many people report feeling a sense of relief when they begin simplifying, as if they've put down a heavy burden they didn't realize they were carrying. Importantly, Zen simplicity isn't about creating another rigid ideal to live up to. It doesn't demand that we own exactly one bowl or live in a perfectly minimalist space. The point isn't the specific number of possessions, but our relationship with them. Can we use them lightly, without excessive attachment? Can we appreciate what serves a purpose now while being willing to let it go when it no longer does? Can we enjoy beautiful things without feeling they define our worth? The story of the Master's tea bowl reminds us that freedom comes not from having nothing, but from holding what we have lightly, recognizing its temporary utility without mistaking it for something that can provide lasting fulfillment or define who we are. Like the flowing river of our changing self, our possessions and circumstances are in constant flux. True security comes not from trying to freeze this flow or cling to particular configurations, but from developing the flexibility to move with change, finding contentment in the midst of impermanence. The freedom that comes from simplicity and holding possessions lightly extends to another powerful aspect of Zen practice: how we relate to negativity directed at us by others. There's a famous story that illustrates this teaching with remarkable clarity. A Zen master was known throughout the region for his wisdom and equanimity. One day, a man with a reputation for having a violent temper came to test the master. Standing before him, the visitor began hurling insults, criticizing his appearance, questioning his wisdom, and mocking his teachings. The master listened calmly without any visible reaction. After several minutes of this abuse, the angry man grew frustrated by the master's lack of response. Finally, he demanded, "So do you have anything to say after I've insulted you so thoroughly?" The master looked at him kindly and asked, "If someone offers you a gift and you decline to accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" "To the giver, of course," replied the confused visitor. "Exactly," smiled the master, "and so I decline to accept your insults. They remain with you." This simple yet profound story captures an essential teaching about how we can choose our relationship with negativity. Most of us automatically absorb criticism, insults, or hostility directed our way. Someone says something unkind and we immediately take it in, turning it over in our minds, defending against it internally, or incorporating it into our self-image. We might replay the interaction for days or even years afterward, continuing to feel the sting of words long after they were spoken. The master in the story demonstrates a radically different approach. He recognizes that negativity from others is like an offered gift. We have the choice whether to accept it or not. When someone expresses anger, criticism, or judgment toward us, they're essentially extending an energetic package. We can automatically reach out and take this package, making it our own problem, or we can compassionately decline the offering, allowing it to remain with the giver. This teaching doesn't suggest becoming cold or unresponsive to others. The master didn't ignore the angry man or dismiss him rudely. He listened attentively and responded with genuine care. Nor does it mean pretending that hurtful words have no impact. We naturally feel the initial impact of negativity. Rather, it points to our freedom in how we process and relate to that impact over time. The initial feeling may arise automatically, but the ongoing relationship with that feeling involves choice. Many of us have experienced the difference between these two approaches, even if we weren't consciously applying Zen principles. Perhaps you've had the experience of receiving criticism and immediately becoming defensive, ruminating on the interaction for days afterward. And perhaps you've also had the experience of hearing something potentially hurtful but somehow not taking it personally, maybe because you were in a particularly good mood, or because you recognized the other person was speaking from their own pain, rather than saying something objectively true about you. The practice of not accepting the gift of negativity requires awareness of our habitual reactions. When someone criticizes or insults us, we typically respond in one of two ways: either defensive anger, fighting back, perhaps with our own criticism of the other person, or internalized shame, accepting the negative view as true about ourselves. Both responses involve taking ownership of the negativity, either by mirroring it back or by absorbing it into our self-image. A Zen approach offers a middle path, neither lashing out nor absorbing. We can acknowledge the other person's expression without identifying with it as mine or making it part of our story. This is particularly powerful when combined with the understanding of non-self we explored earlier. If we don't cling to a fixed idea of who we are, criticism has nowhere solid to stick. Like water flowing around a rock, we can allow negative energy to pass through our awareness without being defined by it. This practice becomes easier when we recognize that most negative communication is about the speaker rather than the target. When someone lashes out in anger, they're usually expressing their own pain, fear, or unmet needs. Their words reveal their inner state more than any objective truth about us. Understanding this allows us to respond with compassion rather than defensiveness. As one teacher put it, when someone throws mud at you, they're the one left with dirty hands. The practical application of this teaching can transform difficult relationships in daily life. In family dynamics, workplace tensions, or community disagreements, we often get caught in cycles of reactivity. Someone says something hurtful, we absorb and react to it. They respond to our reaction, and the negativity compounds. By practicing not accepting the gift, we can interrupt these cycles. When we don't absorb and amplify negativity, we create space for something different to emerge. Importantly, declining to accept negativity doesn't mean avoiding healthy feedback or constructive criticism. We can be open to learning from others without identifying with their negative judgments. The key distinction is whether we're able to consider the information without defining ourselves by it. Can we hear that someone is disappointed in our actions without concluding, "I am a disappointment"? Can we acknowledge making a mistake without deciding, "I am a failure"? The freedom that comes from this practice isn't just about having more pleasant interactions. At a deeper level, it's about recognizing our fundamental worthiness that doesn't depend on others' opinions or approval. When we stop outsourcing our self-worth to other people's judgments, positive or negative, we discover a more stable ground of being. Like the master in the story we can listen to praise or criticism with the same equanimity, neither inflated by one nor deflated by the other. This approach to negativity reflects a broader principle in Zen, that our suffering largely comes not from events themselves, but from our relationship to those events. The master didn't control the angry man's behavior, but he controlled his own response to it. Similarly, we can't prevent others from expressing negativity, but we can practice not absorbing it as our truth. In this way, we discover a freedom that doesn't depend on controlling external circumstances, but on cultivating inner clarity. This teaching about choosing our relationship with negativity connects naturally to another essential Zen understanding: how we relate to mortality and impermanence. Once a beer, a student approached a renowned Zen master and asked anxiously, "Master, how do you prepare yourself for death?" The old master, who was in his 80s, looked at the student with bright, clear eyes and smiled. "Preparing for death? I'm doing it right now," he said. "I prepare by dying with each breath." Confused, the student pressed further. "What do you mean, dying with each breath?" "Each exhale is a small letting go, a little death," the master explained. "The breath goes out, and there's no guarantee another will come. When I fully release each breath without clinging to it, I practice for the final release. This moment is already complete, needing nothing from the next. That's how I prepare, by fully living and fully dying in each moment." This story captures a profound Zen approach to impermanence and mortality. Rather than treating death as a distant, fearsome event to be avoided in conversation and thought, Zen practice invites us to make friends with mortality by recognizing the small deaths that occur continuously throughout life. Each moment arises and passes away, never to return in exactly the same form. Each breath, each thought, each experience appears and dissolves. By paying close attention to this constant flow, we gradually become more comfortable with the nature of impermanence. Most of us live with a subtle but persistent denial of our mortality. We know intellectually that we will die, but we organize our lives, make our plans, and structure our identities as if we had unlimited time. This denial creates a disconnect from reality that actually intensifies fear rather than alleviating it. The more we try to push death away from our awareness, the more threatening it becomes when circumstances force us to confront it. Serious illness, the death of someone close to us, or advancing age eventually break through our denial, often causing significant psychological distress. Zen offers a different approach. Instead of denial, direct engagement. By bringing awareness to the reality of impermanence in ordinary moments, we gradually develop a familiarity with the transient nature of existence. This familiarity doesn't eliminate the natural human concern about death, but it transforms our relationship with that concern from fearful avoidance to curious acceptance. Many Zen practitioners engage in specific contemplations of mortality as part of their training. Some monasteries maintain charnel grounds where monks regularly meditate among human remains. Other traditions encourage practitioners to contemplate their own death daily, not in a morbid or depressing way, but as a means of clarifying priorities and awakening appreciation for the precious opportunity of being alive. As one teacher put it, the contemplation of death is really the contemplation of life because they are inseparable. These practices might seem dark or disturbing to those raised in cultures where death is institutionalized and hidden from view. However, their purpose is not to induce fear or depression, but to align our awareness with reality in a way that ultimately brings greater peace and presence. When we fully acknowledge the limited time we have, we naturally become more discerning about how we use that time. Petty concerns and trivial grievances often fall away when viewed in light of our mortality. Our capacity to appreciate simple pleasures and meaningful connections deepens. The Zen approach to death doesn't promote a grim fatalism or passive resignation. Rather, it fosters an engaged acceptance that allows us to live more fully. When we recognize that nothing lasts forever, including ourselves, we can hold life more lightly and appreciatively. Like watching a beautiful sunset while knowing it will soon disappear, awareness of impermanence often enhances rather than diminishes our experience. This perspective offers practical benefits for navigating life's inevitable losses. When we understand at a deep level that all things are impermanent, relationships, health, achievements, possessions, we can meet changes with less resistance and recovery more quickly from disappointments. Instead of being surprised and overwhelmed when things change, we can acknowledge, this too is impermanence at work. The Master's response about dying with each breath points to how this understanding can be integrated into everyday awareness. The breath offers a continuous reminder of impermanence that's always available to us. Each inhale arises, each exhale passes away. By bringing mindful attention to this natural rhythm, we train ourselves in the art of letting go. We practice embracing the fullness of each moment and releasing it completely, preparing not just for death, but for all the small releases that life continuously demands of us. Paradoxically, this intimate relationship with impermanence doesn't diminish joy, but deepens it. When we recognize that each moment is unique and unrepeatable, ordinary experiences take on a poignant beauty. The appreciation of cherry blossoms into Japanese culture exemplifies this perspective. The flowers are considered most beautiful precisely because their blooming is so brief. Their impermanence doesn't make them less valuable, it makes them more precious. In embracing impermanence, Zen practice doesn't deny the natural grief that comes with loss. When someone we love dies, when health declines, or when valued circumstances change, sadness is a natural and appropriate response. The difference lies in whether we compound that natural grief with resistance and denial, or whether we can move through it with awareness and acceptance, understanding that change is not a personal affront but the very nature of existence. The freedom that comes from making peace with impermanence is not freedom from death. None of us escapes mortality, but freedom from the fear that constricts life. When we no longer organize our lives around the avoidance of endings, we can live with a greater authenticity and presence. Like the master dying with each breath, we discover that the capacity to fully let go is intimately connected with the capacity to fully live. The Zen approach to embracing impermanence connects naturally with another important teaching about how our thoughts create habitual patterns that can limit our freedom. In Zen Buddhism, there's a classic series of 10 illustrations known as the ox-herding pictures that depict the spiritual journey. While the entire sequence is rich with meaning, the fundamental insight they convey about our thought patterns is particularly relevant to understanding how we become trapped in mental habits and how we can free ourselves. Our minds, like cattle, naturally create paths through repeated use. Just as a cow walking the same route day after day creates a visible trail in the grass, our thoughts tend to follow familiar neural pathways that become deeper and more automatic with each use. These mental tracks become so habitual that we mistake them for reality itself, rather than recognizing them as conditioned patterns of perception and interpretation. Think about your typical morning routine. For most people, it follows a predictable sequence with little conscious thought, perhaps checking your phone, brushing your teeth, making coffee, all in the same order day after day. This kind of habituation is helpful for efficiency, but the same process happens with our thinking patterns, often in ways that limit rather than serve us. You might have a habitual thought pattern of self-criticism that activates whenever you make a mistake, or an automatic narrative about being disrespected that triggers whenever someone doesn't respond as you expect. Neuroscience confirms what Zen practitioners have observed for centuries: neurons that fire together wire together. Every time we think a particular thought, the neural pathway for that thought becomes stronger and more likely to activate in the future. Eventually, these patterns become so automatic that they seem to arise on their own, creating the illusion that our thoughts are objective observations about reality, rather than conditioned interpretations. The first step in liberating ourselves from these fixed thought patterns is simply becoming aware of them. In Zen practice, meditation serves as a powerful tool for observing how thoughts arise and follow predictable sequences. A practitioner might notice, for example, how a fleeting memory of an awkward social interaction automatically triggers thoughts of self-judgment, which then lead to comparing oneself unfavorably to others, which then generates anxiety about future interactions. This entire sequence might unfold in seconds, completely automatically, unless mindful awareness interrupts the pattern. As awareness of these patterns develops, we begin to recognize how constructed and conditional they are. We see that our anxious thoughts aren't revealing some objective truth about our inadequacy, but simply following a well-worn neural path. Our angry reactions to certain triggers aren't inevitable responses to objective provocations, but habitual interpretations that we've reinforced through repetition. This recognition creates space between stimulus and response, what one teacher called the pause of freedom, where we can choose whether to follow the old path or try something different. Zen masters throughout history have recognized that these mental habits are particularly difficult to break through conventional approaches. Logical arguments or willpower alone rarely disrupt deeply ingrained thought patterns. This is why Zen practice often employs unexpected methods to jolt practitioners out of habitual thinking: the sudden shout, the paradoxical statement, the seemingly nonsensical question. These techniques aim to momentarily interrupt the usual flow of thoughts, creating a brief opening where fresh perception becomes possible. In daily life, we can work with our mental habits in several practical ways. First, simply naming a pattern when we notice it can reduce its power. Ah, there's my not good enough story again. Or, I notice I'm running my people always let me down narrative. This naming creates a bit of distance that helps us avoid complete identification with the thought pattern. We can also deliberately introduce new elements into habitual sequences. If you notice you always respond to criticism with defensiveness, you might practice taking 3 deep breaths before responding, creating space for a different possibility to emerge. If you habitually ruminate on problems before sleep, you might intentionally redirect your attention to sensations in your body or to counting your breaths. Perhaps most importantly, we can practice meeting our habitual thought patterns with kindness rather than judgment. Many people, upon recognizing their repetitive negative thoughts, add another layer of negativity by criticizing themselves for having these patterns. This only strengthens the underlying neural pathways. A more effective approach is gentle, curious awareness that acknowledges the pattern without condemning it. I see this thought arising again. That's what minds do. How interesting. The freedom that comes from recognizing the cow paths of our thoughts isn't about never having negative or repetitive thoughts again. Rather, it's about developing a new relationship with all our thoughts, seeing them as conditioned patterns rather than absolute truths, as mental events rather than reality itself. Like watching clouds move across the sky, we can observe our thoughts without being completely identified with or defined by them. This understanding of mental habits connects intimately with the Zen teachings on non-attachment and impermanence we've already explored. When we recognize the constructed nature of our thought patterns, we can hold them more lightly, without the desperate clinging that creates suffering. We can use helpful thought patterns as tools while remaining aware of their provisional, constructed nature, and we can allow unhelpful patterns to arise and pass without fueling them with our attention and belief. The ox-herding metaphor reminds us that liberation doesn't come from never having thoughts or from achieving some perfect mental state. Instead, it comes from changing our relationship with our thoughts, no longer being unconsciously driven by them, but consciously engaging with them. The ox isn't banished or killed. It's tamed, understood, and ultimately integrated. Similarly, our habitual thought patterns don't need to be eliminated, an impossible task, but recognized for what they are, conditioned process rather than absolute realities. This understanding of mental patterns naturally connects to another classic Zen story that illustrates how moral judgments can become another form of attachment that limits our freedom and compassion. The story involves 2 monks walking together on a long journey. They came to a river where they met a young woman in a silk kimono, unable to cross. Without hesitation, the older monk picked her up and carried her across the water, setting her down on the other side. The 2 monks continued their journey in silence. 5 hours later, the younger monk could contain himself no longer. "As monks, we are forbidden to touch women," he said. "How could you carry that woman across the river?" The older monk looked at him and replied, "I put her down on the riverbank 5 hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" This deceptively simple story cuts to the heart of how we often cling to moral judgments long after they've served any useful purpose. The younger monk was technically correct about their monastic rules, which indeed prohibited physical contact with women. Yet his rigid adherence to the letter of this rule prevented him from seeing its spirit to protect the monks and women from inappropriate attachment. When faced with someone needing genuine help, the older monk recognized that compassionate action in the moment was more important than rigid rule following. What makes this story particularly powerful is not just the older monk's initial action, but his response afterward. He didn't continue thinking about the woman or his interaction with her. He completely let go of the experience once it was over, while the younger monk spent hours mentally replaying the incident, judging his companion, and building up righteous indignation. The younger monk was carrying the woman in his mind long after the actual encounter had ended. This pattern is remarkably common in everyday life. We frequently hold on to judgments about others' actions or our own long after the original situation has passed. Someone cuts us off in traffic, and we're still mentally complaining about it an hour later. We make a mistake at work, and we're still berating ourselves days afterward. We observe someone violate one of our moral principles, and we replay their transgression in our minds repeatedly, cementing our judgment of their character. The older monk demonstrates a different possibility, responding appropriately to the needs of the moment and then letting go completely. This doesn't mean he lacked moral principles or boundaries. On the contrary, he understood the deeper purpose of their monastic rules well enough to know when compassion called for flexibility. But he didn't allow his action to become a source of ongoing mental commentary or self-congratulation. He simply responded to what was needed and moved on. This story challenges us to examine our relationship with moral judgments in several ways. First, it invites us to distinguish between helpful discernment and rigid moralism. Discernment recognizes that different situations may call for different responses, while moralism applies fixed rules regardless of context. The older monk displayed discernment by recognizing that the principle of compassion sometimes outweighs specific behavioral prohibitions. Second, the story highlights how clinging to judgments often causes more suffering for ourselves than for those we're judging. The younger monk's indignation didn't affect the older monk or the woman. It only disturbed his own peace of mind. When we hold on to judgments about others' actions, we're often the primary victims of our own rigid thinking. Third, the tale points to the difference between momentary evaluation that guides action and ongoing judgment that serves no practical purpose. In daily life, we naturally need to make countless evaluations. Is this food safe to eat? Is this person trustworthy in this situation? Should I take this job? These evaluations help us navigate our lives wisely. Problems arise when these evaluations harden into fixed judgments about people's essential nature, or when we continue to mentally revisit situations long after we can affect them. Practically speaking, we can work with moral judgments much as we work with other thought patterns. When we notice ourselves carrying someone long after an interaction has ended, we can gently bring our attention back to the present moment. When we find ourselves applying rigid moral categories to complex situations, we can ask ourselves what response would best serve compassion and understanding in this specific context. This doesn't mean abandoning all moral principles or ethical boundaries. The Zen approach isn't moral relativism, but a middle way that recognizes both the importance of ethical guidelines and the necessity of contextual wisdom. Rules and principles serve as valuable general guidance, but their application requires discernment, compassion, and attention to the unique circumstances of each situation. The freedom that comes from loosening our grip on moral judgments isn't freedom from responsibility, but freedom from the suffering caused by rigid thinking and ongoing mental commentary. Like the older monk, we can respond appropriately to each situation as it arises, and then let it go completely, without the burden of carrying our judgments with us into the next moment. This lightness allows us to meet each new situation with fresh eyes and an open heart, unencumbered by the weight of past judgments. The insight about letting go of judgments naturally connects with another classic Zen story that addresses our endless desires for power, status, and recognition. This parable, known as the Stonecutter, offers a powerful perspective on how the pursuit of ever-increasing influence and status keeps us trapped in perpetual dissatisfaction. The story begins with a simple stonecutter who spent his days in the mountains, cutting and selling stones for a modest living. Though his work was hard, he initially took pride in his skill and found satisfaction in the steady rhythm of his labour. One day, while delivering stones to a wealthy merchant's home, he was struck by the luxury and apparent ease of the merchant's life. If only I were a wealthy merchant, he thought, instead of a humble stonecutter, then I would truly be happy. Mysteriously, his wish was granted. He suddenly found himself transformed into a rich merchant, surrounded by luxury and servants. For a time, he enjoyed his new status and comfort, but one day, he observed a high government official passing through town. The official sat in a fine palanquin carried by servants, while people bowed deeply as he passed. The former stonecutter, now a merchant, thought, "That official has far more power and respect than a mere merchant. If only I were a government official, then I would truly be happy." Again his wish was granted, and he became a powerful official, carried everywhere in his palanquin, feared and respected by all. He enjoyed this new power until one hot summer day when he noticed how uncomfortable he felt despite his exalted position. The sun beat down mercilessly, causing him to sweat inside his fine robes. Looking up at the sun, he thought, "The sun has power even over officials. If only I were the sun, then I would truly be happy." His wish was granted once more, and he became the sun, shining fiercely upon the earth, his rays reaching everything and everyone. He enjoyed this immense power, until a cloud moved in front of him, blocking his light from reaching the earth. That cloud overshadows even the sun, he thought. If only I were a cloud, then I would truly be happy. Transformed into a cloud, he delighted in drifting across the sky and releasing rain whenever he chose, washing away roads and flooding fields. But soon he found himself being pushed by something more powerful, the wind. The wind is stronger than any cloud, he realized. If only I were the wind, then I would truly be happy. As the wind, he blew with great force, bending trees and scattering leaves, pushing clouds and cooling the sun. He revelled in this new power until he encountered something that wouldn't move despite his mightiest efforts, a great stone mountain. No matter how fiercely he blew, the mountain stood unmoved. This mountain is more powerful even than the wind, he thought. If only I were a mountain, then I would truly be happy. His wish was granted, and he became a mighty mountain, more powerful than the wind, untroubled by the sun or rain. He stood majestic and unmovable until he felt a curious pain in his side. Looking down, he saw a simple stone cutter, chipping away at his slopes with hammer and chisel, and suddenly he realized that the stone cutter was more powerful even than the mountain. This cyclical tale brilliantly illustrates how the pursuit of ever-increasing power, status, and influence leads not to lasting satisfaction, but to an endless cycle of new desires. Each position achieved, rather than bringing contentment, simply reveals another level of power to be desired. The wealthy merchant envies the government official, Tim, who envies the sun, which envies the cloud, and on it goes. This cycle never reaches a point of genuine fulfillment because external power and status cannot address the internal causes of our dissatisfaction. Many of us can recognize this pattern in our own lives, though perhaps in less dramatic form. We think, I'll be happy when I get that promotion, but after receiving it, we quickly begin looking toward the next level up. We imagine that a certain amount of money will bring security and contentment, but once achieved, that amount somehow never quite seems enough. We pursue the recognition of certain people, only to find that once received, we crave the approval of still others. The story points to several insights about desire and satisfaction that align with Zen teachings. First, it highlights how our desires are constantly shifting and essentially insatiable when focused on external status and power. Each new position provides only temporary satisfaction before new desires emerge. Second, it shows how we often misattribute our dissatisfaction, believing it comes from our current position rather than from the structure of desire itself. Third, it reveals the circular nature of these pursuits. The stonecutter who envies everyone else ultimately has a power that even the mountain lacks. Zen practice offers an alternative to this cycle of endless craving. Rather than pursuing ever greater external status or influence, it directs us toward finding contentment through acceptance of our current circumstances while working with them skillfully. This doesn't mean resignation to injustice or abandoning meaningful goals. Instead, it suggests that genuine satisfaction comes not from achieving ever higher positions in a hierarchy of status, but from being fully present and engaged with whatever our current situation offers. The stonecutter initially had the capacity for contentment in his original role, taking pride in his skill, appreciating the rhythm of his work, finding satisfaction in his craft. His dissatisfaction began not from his circumstances, but from comparing himself to others and imagining their lives were superior. Zen teaches that we each have the capacity for contentment exactly where we are, if we can release the comparative mind that constantly tells us we need more, better, or different circumstances to be happy. This teaching connects directly to the non-attachment and present moment awareness we've explored in previous stories. When we release our attachment to specific outcomes or positions, we discover a freedom that doesn't depend on external circumstances. When we bring full attention to our current activity, we often find an inherent satisfaction that endless striving for the next achievement misses entirely. The stonecutter, fully engaged with his craft, might have discovered more genuine contentment than he ever found in his various transformations. In practical terms, working with desires for status and recognition involves first becoming aware of how these desires operate in our lives. We can notice when we're comparing ourselves to others, imagining their grass is greener. We can observe when our dissatisfaction springs not from our actual circumstances, but from stories about how things should be or could be, if only. We can recognize when achievement of a long-desired goal quickly leads to new desires rather than lasting satisfaction. With this awareness, we can begin to disentangle our genuine needs and values from socially conditioned desires for status. Rather than automatically pursuing the next rung on whatever ladder we're climbing, we can ask deeper questions. What truly brings me satisfaction? What kind of contribution do I want to make? How can I engage fully with what's already present in my life? These questions point toward a more sustainable contentment than the endless pursuit of power and status illustrated in the Stonecutter's journey. The story of the Stonecutter reveals how our desires for power and recognition can keep us trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction. This insight naturally connects with another fundamental Zen teaching about the limitations of intellectual understanding and the need to move beyond conceptual thinking. This teaching is often presented through the famous koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping? A koan is a paradoxical statement, question, or dialogue used in Zen practice to challenge logical thinking and push students beyond their usual conceptual mind. What is the sound of one hand clapping is perhaps the most widely known koan in Western culture, though it's often misunderstood as merely a clever riddle or philosophical puzzle. In traditional Zen practice, this koan serves a much deeper purpose. It's a tool for liberation from the confines of dualistic thinking. When first encountering this question, most people approach it intellectually. They might consider that clapping requires two hands, so one hand alone couldn't produce a sound. Or they might try to imagine some approximate sound, perhaps a hand swishing through the air. Some might offer clever responses like half the sound of two hands clapping, or philosophical answers about the nature of sound and perception. All these approaches miss the point of the koan practice. The teacher isn't looking for a clever or philosophical answer, but for a direct demonstration of understanding that transcends conceptual thinking entirely. Any answer that comes from intellectual analysis, no matter how sophisticated, will be met with the teacher's rejection, often a simple headshake, a bell ringing to end the interview, or, in some traditions, a shout or even a symbolic blow. This rejection isn't because the student has selected the wrong answer from a range of possible responses, it's because the student is still operating within the realm of conceptual thought, still trying to solve the koan as an intellectual puzzle. The purpose of the koan is precisely to create a crisis in the student's usual way of understanding, pushing them to a different mode of cognition altogether. Many Zen students spend months or even years working with a single koan. They carry the question throughout their daily activities, returning to it during formal meditation, allowing it to permeate their awareness. Initially, they might generate numerous possible answers, gradually exhausting their intellectual resources as each answer is rejected by the teacher. Eventually, some students reach a state of what we might call fertile frustration. They've exhausted their conceptual approaches, but remain deeply engaged with the question. This state sometimes leads to a sudden breakthrough, not to a new conceptual understanding, but to a direct, non-conceptual realization. The student doesn't solve the koan intellectually. Rather, the persistent questioning creates conditions where a different kind of knowing can emerge. This knowing is immediate, direct, and non-dual. It doesn't separate the knower from what is known or divide experience into subject and object. Many people misunderstand this process, imagining that koans are designed to stop thought entirely or to achieve some exotic mystical state. The actual aim is more practical, to reveal the limitations of our usual conceptual thinking and open us to a more direct way of experiencing reality. Conceptual understanding is valuable for many purposes, but it creates a filtered, categorized version of reality that misses the immediacy of direct experience. Our everyday thinking constantly divides experience into dualities: subject-object, good-bad, right-wrong, self-other. This dualistic framework is useful for many practical purposes, but creates a sense of separation that doesn't accord with the interconnected nature of reality. The koan practice doesn't ask us to abandon conceptual thinking permanently, an impossible and unhelpful goal, but to recognize when it's useful and when it becomes a limitation. In daily life, we constantly encounter situations where conceptual understanding reaches its limits. In profound grief or joy, in moments of crisis, in intimate connection with others, or in creative flow states, we often experience reality directly, without the usual conceptual filtering. The koan practice helps us recognize and access this direct perception more consistently, not just in exceptional circumstances. The practical benefits of moving beyond purely intellectual understanding are significant. Many people find themselves trapped in analysis paralysis, endlessly thinking about their problems without resolving them. Others notice that excessive intellectualizing creates distance from their actual lived experience, leaving them feeling disconnected or dissatisfied despite extensive knowledge. Still others discover that certain emotional or psychological patterns resist change, despite being perfectly understood intellectually. In each case, the limitation isn't in having the wrong concepts, but in the inherent constraints of conceptual thinking itself. Some aspects of reality and human experience simply can't be fully captured or transformed through intellectual understanding alone. The koan practice acknowledges this limitation and offers a methodology for accessing more direct modes of knowing. Working with a koan like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, isn't about arriving at the right answer, but about using the question to transform our relationship with knowing itself. The question serves as a finger pointing toward direct experience, not another concept to grasp, but an invitation to perceive without the usual conceptual filters. When this shift happens, even momentarily, we experience a taste of the freedom that comes from not being entirely bound by our conceptual constructions of reality. This doesn't mean abandoning intellectual understanding. Zen students still learn doctrines, study texts, and engage in philosophical discourse. The difference is that they hold these conceptual frameworks lightly, recognizing them as tools rather than absolute truths. Like the raft in the Buddha's parable, concepts help us cross the river but become burdensome if carried after they've served their purpose. The sound of one hand clapping can never be captured in words or concepts, but it can be directly experienced when we open ourselves to reality beyond our usual dualistic thinking. The exploration of direct experience beyond conceptual thinking naturally leads us to one of Buddhism's most vivid parables about the urgency of liberation from attachment. In the Lotus Sutra, one of Mahayana Buddhism's most influential texts, the Buddha shares the story of the burning house, a powerful metaphor that illustrates why we must free ourselves from the fires of attachment and how skillful means might help us do so. The parable tells of a wealthy man who returns home to discover his large mansion engulfed in flames. To his horror, he sees his children inside, oblivious to the danger, absorbed in their games and toys. The house has only one narrow door for escape. The father calls urgently to his children, "Come out quickly, the house is on fire!" But the children, completely engrossed in their play, ignore his warnings. They don't comprehend the danger. They can't see the fire spreading around them. The desperate father realizes that his direct warnings aren't working. His children are so attached to their toys and games that they can't recognize the mortal danger they face. So he shifts his approach. Knowing his children's interests, he calls out, "I have wonderful toys for you outside, deer carts, goat carts, and ox carts, all beautifully made. Come out and play with them." Hearing about these exciting new toys, the children immediately rush out through the narrow door to safety. Once they're safely outside, the father doesn't actually provide the specific carts he promised. Instead, he gives each child something far better, a magnificent carriage drawn by white oxen, more wonderful than anything he'd described. This parable operates on multiple levels, but its central message addresses how attachment keeps us trapped in dangerous situations that we fail to recognize as harmful. In Buddhist understanding, the burning house represents our condition in samsara, the cycle of suffering created by attachment, aversion, and delusion. The fire specifically symbolizes the three poisons or three boas that Buddhism identifies as the root causes of suffering: greed, attachment to what we want; hatred, aversion to what we don't want; and ignorance, fundamental misunderstanding of reality. Just like the children playing in the burning house, we often remain oblivious to the suffering caused by our attachments. We continue pursuing pleasure, accumulating possessions, seeking status, and avoiding discomfort, not recognizing how these very pursuits keep us trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction. We're so absorbed in our habitual patterns that we don't notice the fire spreading around us, the stress, anxiety, conflict, and emptiness that often accompany lives driven by insatiable wanting. The father in the story represents compassionate wisdom that recognizes our predicament even when we don't. His initial direct approach, simply telling the children about the danger, parallels straightforward spiritual teachings about impermanence, suffering, and non-self. While these teachings are true, they often don't motivate people who are deeply attached to their current pursuits. Most of us, like the children, can continue with our habitual patterns despite intellectual understanding of their harmful effects. The father's skillful means, offering toys that appeal to the children's interests, represents how spiritual teachings might be adapted to meet people where they are. Rather than expecting everyone to immediately embrace profound renunciation, wise teachers often begin with practices that align with people's current values and interests. Someone primarily concerned with health might initially be drawn to meditation for stress reduction. Another person focused on relationships might be attracted to loving-kindness practices. Someone else might connect with mindfulness as a way to enhance creativity or work performance. These entry points aren't deceptive tricks, but compassionate methods that start with people's current motivations while pointing toward deeper freedom. The magnificent carriage eventually given to each child represents the greater liberation that transcends our initial limited spiritual goals. We might begin meditation to reduce stress, but eventually discover a profound shift in how we relate to all experience. We might start practicing generosity to improve relationships, but ultimately find it transforms our entire relationship with possessions and security. Importantly, the parable doesn't suggest that the father was wrong to use skillful means. On the contrary, it presents his approach as wise and compassionate, recognizing that sometimes direct statements about difficult truths don't motivate change. This challenges a common misconception about Buddhism as always demanding brutal honesty regardless of circumstances. The Buddha taught the middle way in communication, as in other aspects of practice. Neither harsh truth that overwhelms people, nor pleasant falsehoods that keep them trapped, but skillful communication that helps them move toward greater freedom. For those of us not living in ancient India, the practical question becomes how to recognize the fires in our own lives and find motivation to leave the burning house. Unlike literal flames, the fires of attachment, aversion, and delusion don't announce themselves with smoke and heat. They often masquerade as normal, even necessary parts of a successful life. The drive for achievement, the accumulation of possessions, the pursuit of sensory pleasures, the avoidance of discomfort. We might begin to recognize these fires by noticing their effects, the anxiety that accompanies attachment to outcomes, the stress of maintaining and protecting possessions, the persistent dissatisfaction that follows even successful achievement of goals, the emotional reactivity triggered when things don't go as we want. These symptoms suggest we're still playing with toys in a burning house, absorbed in pursuits that ultimately cannot provide lasting satisfaction or security. The path out of the burning house doesn't require dramatic renunciation of all worldly involvement. Rather, it invites a shifted relationship with our pursuits and possessions, engaging with them lightly without the desperate clinging that creates suffering. We can still work toward goals, own useful things, enjoy pleasant experiences, and avoid unnecessary pain. The difference lies in how we hold these activities, not as the ultimate sources of happiness and security, but as provisional, changing aspects of experience. The parable reminds us that liberation from attachment isn't just a philosophical ideal, but an urgent practical necessity. Just as the children faced immediate danger from the fire, our attachments create real suffering now, not in some distant future. The freedom available when we step outside the burning house isn't an abstract spiritual state, but the immediate relief that comes when we release our desperate grasp on things that cannot provide lasting happiness. This understanding of how attachment creates suffering naturally connects with another powerful Zen story that illustrates finding peace even in the most difficult circumstances. Known as The Man in the Well, or sometimes The Strawberry, this tale offers a striking perspective on how we can discover freedom in the midst of challenging situations by fully embracing the present moment. The story describes a man walking alone in the wilderness who suddenly finds himself chased by a ferocious tiger. Running for his life, he comes to the edge of a cliff. With the tiger closing in behind him and no other escape route, he notices a vine growing down the cliff face. He quickly grabs it and lowers himself over the edge, dangling above a seemingly bottomless ravine. As he hangs there, temporarily safe from the tiger above, he looks down and sees another tiger at the bottom of the cliff, waiting for him to fall. As if this weren't trouble enough, he then notices two mice, one white and one black, beginning to gnaw on the vine just above him. Slowly but steadily, they're eating through his only support. Hanging from the cliff with danger above and below, and his lifeline being systematically destroyed, the man notices a wild strawberry growing from a crevice in the rock face just within reach. He plucks it, puts it in his mouth, and exclaims, "Ah, how sweet!" This dark, vivid story captures the essential human condition in a way that resonates across cultures and centuries. The tigers represent the inevitable bookends of our mortality, birth and death that define the boundaries of human life. No matter how we try to escape, we are all caught between these realities. The black and white mice, often interpreted as night and day, represent the passage of time that steadily diminishes our lifespan, bringing us closer to the inevitable fall. What makes this story so powerful is not the depiction of our precarious situation. Most of us are already aware of our mortality at some level, but the man's response to it. Rather than being paralyzed by fear or lost in denial about his circumstances, he fully experiences the sweetness of the strawberry available in that moment. Without dismissing or minimizing his dangerous situation, he still manages to be completely present for the small joy within reach. This response illustrates a core teaching of Zen, that freedom is available not by escaping our circumstances, but by fully engaging with them as they are. The man doesn't pretend the tigers aren't there or that the vine isn't being gnawed through. He doesn't construct elaborate fantasies about rescue. Instead, he remains present with what is, including both the danger and the sweetness that coexist in his experience. Many of us spend our lives trying to escape the knowledge of our mortality and impermanence. We distract ourselves with endless activities, numb ourselves with various substances or technologies, or construct elaborate belief systems designed to deny the tigers. Others become so preoccupied with the dangers, so fixated on health concerns, financial worries, or existential dread, that they miss the strawberries available in each moment. Both approaches lead to a diminished life, either through denial of reality or through inability to access joy within reality. The Zen approach suggests a middle way, neither ignoring our precarious situation nor becoming overwhelmed by it. We acknowledge the tigers, notice the mice at work, and still reach for the strawberry. This isn't spiritual bypassing or toxic positivity that denies difficulties. On the contrary, it's a clear-eyed acceptance of the full spectrum of our experience, including both its challenges and its gifts. In practical terms, this story invites us to notice the strawberries available in our daily lives, even amid difficulties. During illness, can we still appreciate the kindness of a caregiver or the warmth of sunlight through a window? During financial hardship, can we still enjoy the taste of simple food or the comfort of a friend's company? During times of loss, can we still notice moments of beauty or connection that arise alongside grief? This capacity to experience joy in difficult circumstances isn't about maintaining constant happiness regardless of conditions. The man hanging from the cliff surely felt fear, concern, and other natural responses to danger. The point isn't to suppress these feelings, but to recognize that they can coexist with moments of appreciation and even delight. Our lives contain both tigers and strawberries, often simultaneously. Meditation practice helps develop this capacity by training us to be present with our entire experience rather than selectively attending only to what's pleasant or only to what's threatening. We learn to hold the full spectrum of experience in awareness, noticing the pleasant without clinging to it, acknowledging the unpleasant without rejecting it, and recognizing that both are impermanent aspects of a continuously changing reality. The story also points to how our quality of life depends less on our external circumstances than on our relationship to those circumstances. Two people facing identical challenges might have radically different experiences based on their ability to remain present and open to whatever their situation offers. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try to improve difficult conditions when possible, but it suggests that our well-being isn't entirely dependent on those conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the parable reminds us that the present moment is where life actually happens. While hanging from the cliff, the man couldn't change the past decisions that led him there, or control whether he would eventually fall. His only point of agency was how he experienced the moment at hand. By choosing to taste the strawberry, rather than remaining lost in regret about the past or anxiety about the future, he experienced the freedom available within even the most constrained circumstances. The ability to find joy amid difficulty connects beautifully with another profound Buddhist story about how we heal from grief by recognizing the universality of suffering. This ancient tale, known as the mustard seed, offers a compassionate perspective on loss that stands in stark contrast to many modern approaches to grief. The story begins with a young mother named Kisa Gotami who lived during the Buddha's time. She had a young son, her only child, whom she adored beyond measure. Tragically, the child fell ill and died suddenly, leaving Kisa devastated. Overcome with grief and unable to accept her son's death, she carried his body from house to house, desperately seeking medicine to revive him. People looked at her with pity, recognizing that her mind had been unhinged by grief. Finally, someone suggested she visit the Buddha, who might have the medicine she sought. Carrying her dead child, Kisa approached the Buddha and begged him to bring her son back to life. Looking at her with deep compassion, the Buddha responded, "I can help you, but first I need a small ingredient for the medicine. Bring me a mustard seed from a house where no one has ever died." Feeling hopeful for the first time since her child's death, Kisa set out immediately, going from house to house in the village, asking for a mustard seed. In each home, the residents readily offered the tiny seed, but when she asked whether anyone had died in their household, the answers were always the same. "Yes, my father died last year," said one. "My sister died in childbirth," said another. "We lost our grandparents and an uncle," said a third. House after house, family after family, Kisa encountered the same reality. There was no home untouched by death. As she continued her search throughout the day and into the evening, a profound realization gradually dawned on her. Death wasn't a unique tragedy that had singled her out. It was the universal experience of all living beings. By nightfall, Kisa returned to the Buddha empty-handed, but with a transformed understanding. "I could find no house where death has not come," she said quietly. The Buddha responded gently, "You thought you alone had lost a son? The law of death is that among all the living creatures there is no permanence." With this new awareness, Kisa was able to bury her child and begin her healing process. She later became a follower of the Buddha, eventually attaining significant spiritual insight through her practice. What makes this story so powerful is how it addresses grief not through denial or distraction, but through a wider perspective that connects individual suffering with universal human experience. Modern approaches to grief sometimes inadvertently isolate the bereaved, treating their pain as an anomaly to be fixed or an inconvenience to be moved past quickly. The mustard seed parable offers a different view, that connecting with the shared experience of loss can be deeply healing. The Buddha in this story doesn't minimize Kisa's grief or offer empty platitudes. He doesn't tell her that her son is in a better place or that she'll feel better soon, nor does he suggest that her grief is a form of attachment that she should simply release through spiritual practice. Instead, he creates conditions for her to discover a truth that makes her suffering bearable, that she is not alone in her experience of loss. This understanding doesn't eliminate pain, but it transforms our relationship with it. When we recognize that suffering is a universal human experience rather than a personal failing or unique tragedy, we move from isolation to connection. The sense of "why me?" that often compounds grief gives way to a recognition of our shared vulnerability as living beings. What felt like a wall separating us from others becomes a bridge of common humanity. There's solid psychological research supporting this approach to suffering. Studies have found that people recover better from various traumas and losses when they feel their experience is understood and shared by others. This is part of why support groups for everything from addiction to cancer to bereavement can be so effective. They reduce the isolation that often magnifies suffering. Practically speaking, how can we apply the wisdom of this mustard seed story in our lives? When facing loss or hardship, we might deliberately seek connection rather than isolation. This could mean joining a support group, reaching out to friends who've experienced similar difficulties, or even reading accounts of how others have navigated comparable challenges. These connections remind us that our suffering, while uniquely our own, is also part of the broader tapestry of human experience. We can also practice recognizing the universality of suffering in our daily interactions. When we see someone behaving in ways that seem difficult or unskillful, we might remember that they too carry their own sufferings, many of which may be invisible to us. This recognition doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it can help us respond with compassion rather than judgment or anger. Another application involves how we support others in their suffering. Rather than rushing to fix their pain or distract them from it, we might create space for them to express their grief while gently helping them connect with the broader context of shared human experience. Sometimes the most healing thing we can offer is not advice or solutions, but the simple acknowledgement that suffering is normal, understandable, and not faced alone. The mustard seed in this story carries symbolic significance beyond the literal seed. Mustard seeds are tiny yet grow into large plants. Similarly, the small realization that suffering is universal can grow into a transformed perspective that fundamentally changes how we experience life's inevitable pains. The seeds also represent the commonplace nature of this wisdom. It's not exotic or available only to spiritual elites. but accessible in ordinary households and everyday experience. The most profound aspect of the mustard seed story may be how it reveals that healing comes not from escaping suffering, but from entering it more fully with awareness and connection. Kisa began her journey trying to deny or reverse her son's death. Her healing started when she fully accepted the reality of her loss within the context of a world where loss is inevitable for everyone. This acceptance didn't diminish her love for her son or the significance of her grief, but it made the pain bearable by placing it within the larger human story of which we're all a part. This understanding of how we heal through recognizing our shared humanity connects naturally with another Zen story about the freedom that comes from holding possessions lightly. This tale involves a revered Zen master who once received an exquisite gift from a wealthy patron, a rare and valuable vase that was considered a great treasure in the region. The master thanked the donor simply and placed the vase among his few belongings. The valuable object became known throughout the area, and many visitors would comment on its beauty when they came to receive teachings. The master treated it no differently than his other simple possessions, using it when appropriate without special reverence or concern. Several months later, the original donor returned for a visit. During conversation, he noticed the vase was no longer displayed where he had last seen it. With some concern, he asked the master what had happened to the precious gift. "Oh, that vase?" responded the master casually. "It broke last week." The donor appeared visibly upset. "Master, that was an irreplaceable treasure, hundreds of years old. How can you be so careless with such a valuable object?" The master looked at him with gentle eyes and said, "Would you rather I had broken my serenity than vase?" Feeling somewhat chastened, the donor nodded in understanding. As he was preparing to leave, he noticed another exquisite vase, even rarer than the one he had given, sitting among the master's few possessions. Confused, he asked, "Master, where did you get that extraordinary vase? It looks even more valuable than the one I gave you." "Oh," replied the master with a slight smile, "someone else gave that to me recently." "But aren't you worried about breaking it too?" asked the perplexed visitor. "When someone offers something, I receive it with gratitude," the master explained. "When it breaks, I let it go. Actually, the vase you gave me didn't break. I gave it to a sick woman in the village who needed to sell it for medicine. I thought you might be upset if I told you that did, but now I see you're more concerned about my relationship with possessions than about the possessions themselves." The donor bowed deeply, receiving in that moment a teaching more valuable than any vase. This story illustrates a profound aspect of Zen practice, the cultivation of non-attachment to possessions. The master's attitude toward the valuable vase wasn't one of carelessness or disrespect, but of appropriate relationship. He could appreciate the vase's beauty and utility without developing an unhealthy attachment to it. When circumstances called for letting it go to help someone in need, he could do so freely, without the anguish that often accompanies parting with valued possessions. This teaching about non-attachment is frequently misunderstood. It doesn't mean not having or enjoying possessions. The master didn't reject the vase or pretend it wasn't beautiful. He didn't live without any belongings or deny himself the use of functional objects. Non-attachment isn't about having nothing, it's about holding what we have lightly, recognizing its impermanence and remaining free from the kind of clinging that creates suffering when circumstances change. The donor in the story represents our more common relationship with valued possessions. He was attached not just to the vase itself, but to what it represented: status, taste, generosity, perhaps even a kind of immortality through association with something enduring. When he discovered it was no longer there, his distress revealed how much his identity and emotional well-being were tied to the object and its fate. The master's response challenged him to examine whether this attachment served his happiness or undermined it. In our consumer-oriented culture, we're constantly encouraged to identify with our possessions. Advertising doesn't just sell products, it sells identities and emotional states attached to those products. We're taught that certain possessions will make us happier, more attractive, more successful, more secure. As a result, we often develop relationships with our belongings that go far beyond their practical utility, investing them with emotional significance that creates anxiety and suffering. This attachment manifests in various ways: the stress of protecting valuable possessions from damage or theft, the anxiety of keeping up with ever-changing styles and technologies, the burden of maintaining, storing, and managing accumulating stuff, the fear of loss that accompanies ownership of things we believe essential to our happiness. Like the donor in the story, we often sacrifice our serenity for our possessions, rather than recognizing possessions as tools that should serve our well-being. Zen practice offers a middle way between materialistic attachment and ascetic rejection of the material world. It suggests we can have and enjoy possessions while maintaining inner freedom from them. We can appreciate beautiful objects without basing our happiness on owning them. We can use tools and technologies without believing they define us. We can share and give away possessions when circumstances make this appropriate, without feeling we've lost part of ourselves. This approach doesn't require getting rid of all your belongings or never buying anything new. Rather, it involves cultivating awareness of your relationship with possessions. Do you feel anxiety about certain objects being damaged? Do you experience a rush of pleasure when acquiring something new, followed by a quick return to your baseline satisfaction? Do you define yourself by what you own? Does the prospect of losing certain possessions create fear disproportionate to their practical value? Simply noticing these patterns begins to loosen their hold. When you recognize that a possession is triggering attachment or anxiety, you can pause and examine what's happening. What stories are you telling yourself about this object? What emotions are arising? Is the object itself valuable, or is it the meaning you've attached to it? The freedom that comes from holding possessions lightly doesn't just affect your relationship with things, it transforms your entire approach to life. When you're less concerned about acquiring, maintaining, and protecting possessions, you have more energy for experiences, relationships, and growth. When your identity isn't tied to what you own, you're less vulnerable to the inevitable changes and losses that life brings. When you can give freely without anxiety, your relationships become more genuine and generous. Like the master in the story, you might find that this freedom allows you to make choices based on deeper values rather than attachment. You might choose to sell or give away something valuable to help someone in need. You might opt for simplicity over accumulation, quality over quantity, functionality over status. Not because possessions are bad, but because they serve life better when held with open hands rather than clenched fists. The Zen approach to possessions leads naturally to another powerful story about finding joy in the present moment even amidst danger. This variation of the tale we touched on earlier focuses specifically on savouring life's sweetness in precarious circumstances. The story of the tiger and the strawberry captures this teaching with particular vividness. A man was walking alone through the wilderness when he suddenly encountered a hungry tiger. Terrified, he ran as fast as he could until he reached the edge of a steep cliff. With the tiger closing in behind him, he had no choice but to grab a vine growing on the cliff's edge and lower himself down the face of the cliff, dangling precariously above a seemingly bottomless ravine. As he hung there, the tiger prowled and growled at the top of the cliff, just a few feet above him. Looking down, the man discovered another tiger at the bottom of the ravine, pacing back and forth, waiting for him to fall. His situation worsened when he noticed two mice, one white and one black, beginning to gnaw on the vine just above his hands. Slowly but steadily, they were eating through his lifeline. In this moment of extreme danger, with death seemingly inevitable, the man noticed a wild strawberry growing from a small crevice in the rock face just within his reach. Holding tightly to the vine with one hand, he reached out and plucked the strawberry with his other hand. He placed it in his mouth and exclaimed, "Ah, how sweet it tastes!" This particular version of the story places special emphasis on the sweetness of the strawberry, and the man's capacity to fully experience that sweetness despite his dire circumstances. The tigers represent the dangers that threaten us from all sides: illness, aging, financial insecurity, relationship problems, global crises. The mice, often interpreted as day and night, symbolize the passage of time that steadily diminishes our lifespan regardless of how we might try to stop it. What makes this story so compelling is not just the man's predicament, but his response to it. He doesn't deny the reality of his situation or become paralyzed by fear, nor does he become so consumed by planning an escape that he misses the small joy available in that moment. Instead, he fully tastes the strawberry, experiencing its sweetness completely, even as the tiger's wait and the mice gnaw. This capacity to savor life's sweetness amid danger isn't about ignoring real threats or practicing toxic positivity that denies difficulties. It's about expanding our awareness to include the entire spectrum of our experience, both the precarious nature of our situation and the simple pleasures that continue to be available within it. The man doesn't pretend the tigers aren't there. but neither does he allow their presence to prevent him from tasting the strawberry. Many of us struggle with this balance. When facing difficulties, we often become so consumed by worry, planning, or rumination that we miss the simple joys that remain available. During health challenges, we might be so focused on symptoms and treatments that we fail to notice the warmth of sunlight through a window or the comfort of a soft blanket. During financial stress, we might be so preoccupied with bills that we miss the pleasure of a hot cup of tea or a conversation with a friend. During relationship conflicts, we might be so caught in narratives about who's right that we miss moments of connection that arise despite the tension. The story suggests that freedom comes not from escaping our predicaments, but from developing the capacity to be fully present with all aspects of our experience, including both challenges and pleasures. This doesn't mean forcing happiness or pretending everything's fine when it isn't. The man hanging from the cliff surely felt fear and concern about the tigers and mice. But alongside those natural responses, he maintained the capacity to recognize and appreciate sweetness when it appeared. Zen practice helps develop this capacity through mindfulness meditation that trains us to be present with our entire experience rather than fixating exclusively on problems or pleasures. We learn to hold challenges in awareness without being completely overwhelmed by them, and to notice small joys without needing to grasp or prolong them. This balanced awareness allows us to navigate difficulties with greater resilience, while still accessing the nourishment that makes our journey sustainable. The strawberry in this story represents all the small pleasures that continue to be available even in difficult times. The taste of good food, the beauty of nature, moments of connection with others, physical comforts to hold, creative expression, quiet moments of peace. These strawberries aren't trivial distractions, but essential nourishment for our well-being. By fully experiencing them when they appear, we replenish our capacity to face challenges. Importantly, savouring the strawberry doesn't prevent the man from taking appropriate action if an opportunity for escape presents itself. If he spotted a ledge within reach, or heard rescuers approaching, he could certainly respond. The point isn't to become passive in the face of danger, but to avoid becoming so consumed by fear or planning that we miss the life that's available in each moment, regardless of circumstances. Many people who have faced terminal illness or other extreme challenges report discovering this capacity to appreciate simple pleasures with extraordinary intensity. When the future is uncertain, the present moment often becomes more vivid. Sunsets become more beautiful, conversations more meaningful, simple meals more delicious. This isn't about denying the reality of their situation, but about experiencing the fullness of life that remains available within it. We don't need to wait for crisis to develop this capacity. Through regular practice, we can cultivate the ability to taste the strawberry amid everyday challenges. When stuck in traffic, can we appreciate the music playing on the radio? During a difficult work project, can we enjoy the satisfaction of small accomplishments along the way? When worried about a loved one, can we still appreciate the care and connection that worry itself represents? The freedom offered by this practice isn't freedom from having tigers in our lives. Some degree of danger, uncertainty, and difficulty is inevitable for everyone. Rather, it's freedom from having our entire experience defined and limited by those tigers. By maintaining the capacity to recognize and savor sweetness even amid challenges, we discover that life remains rich and worth living, regardless of circumstances. This practice of finding joy in the present moment connects naturally with another key Zen teaching about mindfulness in everyday actions. There's a famous story about a monk who approached his master after a meal, seeking guidance on esoteric spiritual practices. The master asked, "Have you finished eating your rice?" The monk replied, "Yes, I have." "Then wash your bowl," said the master. This seemingly simple instruction contains profound wisdom about the path to spiritual awakening. In just 3 words, wash your bowl, the master pointed to the heart of Zen practice, bringing full awareness to ordinary activities rather than seeking spiritual insights through special techniques or esoteric knowledge. The monk came looking for something extraordinary, perhaps secret meditation methods or profound philosophical teachings. Instead, the master directed him back to the most mundane task imaginable, washing his rice bowl. This instruction challenges the common assumption that spiritual practice is separate from everyday life, or that awakening requires special circumstances. In Zen monasteries, meals are eaten in silence with great attention, and cleaning up afterward is considered just as important a practice as formal meditation. Monks are taught to wash their bowls mindfully, feeling the temperature of the water, noticing the sensation of a bowl and cloth in their hands, being aware of each movement. This isn't to make dishwashing more spiritual, but to recognize that ordinary activities, approached with full attention, are themselves the path to awakening. This teaching directly contradicts our tendency to divide life into important and unimportant moments, spiritual and mundane activities. We often rush through routine tasks like washing dishes, cleaning the house, or commuting to work, treating these activities as meaningless obstacles to get through before we can do something really important or truly meaningful. We save our attention for special occasions while putting our everyday experience on autopilot. The instruction to wash your bowl invites a radical shift in perspective. It suggests that no moment is inherently more significant than any other, and that the quality of our attention matters more than the nature of the activity. Washing dishes with full awareness can be as profound a practice as the most esoteric meditation. Walking mindfully to the mailbox can be as meaningful as a pilgrimage to a sacred site. Preparing a simple meal with complete attention can be as powerful as an elaborate religious ritual. This approach doesn't diminish the value of formal spiritual practices like meditation, prayer, or study. Rather, it extends the boundaries of practice to include all of life. In the Zen tradition, formal meditation zazen is vital, but it's not separate from how we eat, clean, work, and interact with others. The quality of attention we cultivate on the meditation cushion is meant to permeate all our activities. The story also points to the importance of completing each action fully before moving to the next. The master first asks if the monk has finished eating, making sure he was fully present for that activity, before instructing him to wash his bowl. Many of us habitually leave tasks partially completed, physically moving on while our minds remain caught in the previous activity, or mentally jumping ahead to future concerns before finishing what we're doing now. This habit fragments our attention and diminishes our experience of life. Practically speaking, how might we incorporate this teaching into daily life? We could choose one routine activity each day, perhaps brushing teeth, preparing breakfast, or walking to the car, and practice bringing our complete attention to it. Notice the sensations involved, the movements of your body, the sounds and smells. When your mind wanders to other concerns, gently bring it back to the direct experience of the task at hand. We might also practice completing one activity before beginning another. Finish eating before clearing the table. Complete a work task before checking email. End a conversation fully before making a phone call. This doesn't mean becoming rigid about switching between activities, but rather developing the habit of being wholehearted in each moment rather than perpetually divided. The beauty of this practice is its accessibility. While not everyone can meditate for hours daily or attend lengthy retreats, everyone washes dishes or some equivalent, everyone brushes their teeth, everyone walks from one place to another. By transforming these necessary activities into opportunities for mindfulness, we integrate practice into the fabric of daily life rather than trying to squeeze it into an already busy schedule. Many people report that this approach gradually transforms their experience of routine tasks. Activities once considered boring or burdensome become interesting and even enjoyable when approached with full attention. Washing dishes becomes an exploration of sensations, the warmth of the water, the slipperiness of soap, the transformation from dirty to clean. Walking to the mailbox becomes an opportunity to feel the body in motion, notice the changing patterns of light and shadow, hear the ambient sounds of the neighborhood. The instruction to wash your bowl reminds us that Zen practice isn't about escaping ordinary life for some special spiritual realm, but about awakening to the life we're already living. The enlightenment we seek isn't hidden in esoteric practices or distant retreats, but in the direct experience of whatever is happening right now, including tasks as simple as washing a bowl after a meal. By bringing full attention to these ordinary moments, we discover that the sacred isn't separate from the mundane. It's available in every experience when approached with awareness and presence. The practice of bringing mindfulness to everyday activities naturally connects with one of Zen's most profound teachings about the nature of self. In Zen tradition, there's a famous koan or meditation riddle that challenges practitioners to investigate the very core of their identity. Show me your original face before your parents were born. This enigmatic question isn't meant to be answered intellectually, but to be explored deeply through meditation until it cracks open our conventional understanding of who we are. When a Zen teacher first presents this koan to a student, the typical reaction is confusion. How can I have a face before my parents were born? It seems impossible, contradictory. Some students might try clever responses. It's emptiness, or it's Buddha nature. Others might attempt philosophical answers about the nature of existence before birth. But all conceptual answers miss the point entirely. The koan isn't asking for a theory about identity, but inviting direct recognition of something more fundamental than our conventional sense of self. To understand the purpose of this koan, we need to recognize how we normally experience ourselves. Most of us move through life with a strong sense of being a separate, continuous entity. A me that was born at a certain time, has accumulated particular experiences, and will eventually die. This sense of self feels solid and real, the central character in the story of our lives. We defend it when threatened, try to enhance it when possible, and worry about its future. This identification with a separate self seems so obvious and natural that we rarely question it. Yet when we look closely through meditation, this seemingly solid self becomes surprisingly difficult to locate. If you sit quietly and begin searching for this self you take for granted, where exactly is it? Is it in your body? But your body is constantly changing, cells dying and being replaced, energy flowing in and out. Is it in your thoughts? But thoughts come and go without your control. Control arising from countless causes and conditions. Is it in your emotions? But these two fluctuate constantly, appearing and disappearing like weather patterns. As meditation deepens, we might begin to notice that what we call self is more like a process than a fixed entity, continuously changing flow of sensations, perceptions, thoughts and feelings, all arising and passing in awareness. There's experiencing happening, but no solid experiencer separate from the experience. There's thinking happening, but no thinker separate from the thought. There's seeing happening, but no seer separate from what's seen. The koan about our original face points toward this direct recognition. It asks us to look beneath our socially constructed identity, beneath our personal history, beneath all the layers of self-image we've accumulated, to recognize something more fundamental, the aware presence that precedes all these temporary formations. This isn't some mystical entity hiding behind our everyday self, but the very nature of awareness that's already present in every experience. Many people resist this investigation, fearing that discovering the constructed nature of self means they'll lose something essential or fall into nihilistic emptiness. But those who pursue the question typically report the opposite, not a loss, but a profound liberation. When we're no longer exclusively identified with a separate vulnerable self that needs constant protection and enhancement, we experience greater ease, spontaneity, and connection with life. Practically speaking, how does one work with this koan? In formal Zen training, a student might sit with this question for months or even years, bringing it into meditation again and again. Rather than trying to figure out an intellectual answer, they allow the question to work on them, to create a sense of not knowing that gradually erodes their fixed certainties about selfhood. Outside formal Zen training, we can still explore this territory through various practices. In meditation, we might simply observe how the sense of I is constructed moment by moment through identification with certain experiences and rejection of others. We notice how thoughts constantly reference a central me, I like this, I hate that, I should, I shouldn't. We become aware of how emotions trigger self-referential stories that strengthen the sense of separate identity. As awareness of these patterns deepens, we naturally begin holding our sense of self more lightly. We don't need to forcibly deconstruct the ego, a project that would ironically strengthen the very self-sense it aims to dissolve. Instead, we simply observe with curiosity how the self-construct operates, neither rejecting it as bad nor solidifying it as ultimately real. Through this gentle, persistent observation, our identification with a fixed self gradually loosens on its own. This shift in perspective affects everyday life in numerous ways. When criticism arrives, it doesn't feel like an attack on our core being, but merely feedback about particular behaviors or ideas, like weather happening in awareness rather than a threat to who we fundamentally are. When praise comes, we can enjoy it without becoming inflated or dependent on continuous validation. When mistakes occur, we can acknowledge them clearly without the crushing self-judgment that comes from identifying completely with our actions. Relationships often transform as well. When we're not defending a rigid self-image or seeking constant validation, we can listen more openly to others, respond more spontaneously to situations, and connect more authentically beyond our usual social masks. Many people report that as self-preoccupation decreases, natural compassion increases, we recognize others as not fundamentally separate from this aware presence that we all share. The freedom that comes from loosening identification with a separate self doesn't mean becoming dysfunctional or irresponsible. On the contrary, we still maintain a practical sense of identity for navigating daily life, showing up for work, fulfilling commitments, taking care of necessary business. The difference is that we hold this functional identity more lightly, recognizing it as a useful convention rather than an absolute reality that must be defended at all costs. The koan of our original face points to what Zen calls our true nature, not another identity to attain but the aware presence that's already here, obscured only by our habitual identification with a narrower sense of self. When we glimpse this directly, even momentarily, we taste a freedom that doesn't depend on particular circumstances or achievements. We discover that what we've been seeking, security, peace, connection, meaning, was never actually absent, just overlooked in our exclusive focus on enhancing and protecting a separate self. This recognition of our true nature beyond the constructed self naturally leads to the final Zen teaching in our exploration, the understanding that our mind's essential nature is already clear and luminous, only temporarily obscured by the dust of conditioned thinking. Throughout the history of Zen, masters have compared our original mind to a perfect mirror that reflects reality clearly without distortion. The problem isn't that we need to create or attain this clarity, it's that layers of dust, our habitual patterns of thinking, judging, and conceptualizing have accumulated on the mirror, clouding its natural reflectivity. A well-known Zen story illustrates this teaching. In a monastery, two senior disciples were competing to become the next head teacher after their aging master. The master asked them each to compose a poem expressing their understanding of Zen. The first disciple, who was widely expected to win the position, wrote, "The body is like a Bodhi tree, the mind like a bright mirror on a stand. Time after time wipe it diligently, Titu. Don't let it gather dust." This verse expressed a common understanding of practice, the need for continuous effort to keep the mind clear of defilements. But the second disciple, who worked in the kitchen and wasn't considered particularly advanced, wrote in response, "There is no Bodhi tree, nor is there a mirror stand. Since originally there is nothing, where can dust alight?" Upon reading this second verse, the master recognized that this humble kitchen worker had a deeper understanding. While the first disciple still saw practice as an effortful process of purification, the second recognized that our original nature is already complete and perfect. The very idea that there's a separate mirror that needs cleaning is itself a form of dust. This teaching about our original clarity challenges the common assumption that spiritual practice is primarily about adding something to ourselves, acquiring new knowledge, developing special abilities, or achieving particular states of consciousness. Instead, it suggests that awakening is more about removing obstacles to what's already present, recognizing and releasing the conditioned patterns of thinking and perceiving that obscure our natural awareness. Think of how a young child perceives the world with freshness, curiosity, and direct engagement before accumulated concepts and categories start to filter experience. Or consider moments in your own life when perception suddenly became clear and vivid, perhaps in nature during creative activity, in an emergency, or in love. These glimpses of direct, unfiltered awareness aren't exotic achievements, but returns to our natural capacity for clear seeing that gets clouded by habitual thinking. In Zen practice, meditation isn't primarily about achieving special states, but about recognizing the clear awareness that's already present beneath our mental chatter. When we sit quietly and observe the mind, we notice how thoughts and emotions constantly arise and pass, like clouds moving through the sky. With continued practice, we begin to recognize that behind this ever-changing mental weather is a clear, open awareness that remains consistent regardless of what's passing through it. This clear awareness isn't something exotic or separate from ordinary experience. It's simply the knowing quality of mind that's present whenever we're conscious, the awareness that knows sounds as sounds, sensations as sensations, thoughts as thoughts. Usually we're so absorbed in the content of our experience that we overlook this fundamental awareness that makes all experience possible. Meditation helps us recognize what's been here all along. Many spiritual traditions describe elaborate paths of practice leading through stages toward eventual awakening. While these frameworks can be helpful, They sometimes reinforce the idea that clarity is a distant achievement rather than our original state. The Zen approach often emphasizes the directness and immediacy of awakening, that our true nature is already complete, already perfect, already awake. The only thing preventing us from recognizing this is our belief in our own incompleteness. This doesn't mean Zen dismisses practice or effort. Paradoxically, it often takes considerable dedication to recognize what's been here all along. The habits of mind that obscure our natural clarity are deeply ingrained and don't disappear overnight. Regular meditation, mindful living, study with qualified teachers, and practice in community all support the process of letting go of these obscurations. The difference is in how we hold this practice, not as a self-improvement project aimed at constructing a better future state, but as a process of recognizing and returning to what's already here. In daily life, we can practice remembering and returning to this original clarity in various ways. When caught in rumination or worry, we might pause and notice the aware space in which these thoughts are arising. When overwhelmed by strong emotions, we can recognize the clear awareness that knows the emotion is present. In conversations, we can notice the moments of open listening between our mental preparations and reactions. These brief recognitions, repeated over time, help us reorient to our natural clarity rather than remaining exclusively identified with mental content. The sutras often say the ordinary mind is the way, suggesting that the awakened state isn't some specialized condition, but our natural mind when free from distortion. The great freedom comes in discovering that what we've been searching for has been present all along, like someone desperately looking for their glasses while wearing them, or searching the house for a phone while holding it. We've been looking for something that was never actually missing. This understanding completes our exploration of Zen stories about abandoning attachment and finding healing. Through these diverse teachings, from emptying our cup of preconceptions to recognizing the finger pointing to the moon, from letting go of the raft to seeing beyond dualistic thinking, we've circled around the same central insight. Freedom comes not from acquiring something new, but from releasing our attachments to fixed ideas, possessions, status, and ultimately a separate self. When we let go of what was never truly ours to begin with, we discover a natural clarity, peace, and connection that's been available all along, just waiting to be recognized beneath the temporary clouds of our conditioning.